20th century was a period of great strife for many people across the world. Under the rule of cruel and oppressive leaders, nations suffered wars, famine, and legacies of trauma that will continue to last for generations to come. Hi, I'm Rich Burnett for Wondrium, and in this episode of Perspectives, 4 historians discuss some of the most notorious tyrants of the 20th century, and not just the ones you might think. We begin now with a brief look at how dictators wind up in power.
How do we describe a democratically elected government that then uses its mandate to restrict liberal rights? What if a leader wins free and fair elections, but then uses that position of power to impose censorship, to truncate civil liberties, or to persecute an ethnic minority? And what if that leader, all the while, remains popular, or even gets re-elected because of those very actions? These things aren't democratic in one sense of the word, but if that's what the majority wants, what else is it? This isn't just a theoretical question. A lot of the world's most brutal dictatorships, now and historically, are illiberal democracies. Vladimir Putin has systematically dismantled what existed of Russian democracy. He jails dissidents, persecutes ethnic Chechens, and kills journalists. And yet, he's remained immensely popular. Countries like Hungary, Turkey, the Philippines, and Brazil have all elected and sometimes re-elected leaders whose policies are more reminiscent of fascist dictatorships than democracy. And we sometimes forget that even the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s came to power through free and fair elections. And as an added twist, we should remember that illiberal democracies often voice their actions in the language of democracy itself. Adolf Hitler wasn't violating the rights of the German people. He was protecting them from communism and foreign domination. And even when he invaded other countries, he often justified his actions by claiming that he was protecting the ethnic Germans who lived there.
According to Hitler himself, the great masses of the people will more easily fall victims to a big lie than a small one. And the biggest lie for Hitler was to make his enemies think he was a reasonable and restrained person, a moderate nationalist who was at heart a man of peace and a hero for the common man. We now know what a monstrous lie that was, but it's important to recognize that millions were deceived by it for a long time. The idea of one leader changing everything for a nation by the wave of his hand was so appealing to a world plagued by chaos and indecision. The carnage of the First World War, followed by the financial boom and bust of the 1920s, had created a sense of helplessness, as if nothing could be done to prevent another crisis unless one powerful force was mobilized to answer all emergencies and to replace disorder with discipline. Out of fear, people wanted to be led by someone who seemed filled with purpose and confidence. At its mildest level, this was simply what Franklin Roosevelt was offering Americans in his presidency. But in its most dangerous forms, it gave the world Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin.
Stalin was preeminent as leader from around 1929 to 1953, roughly a quarter century. So an entire third of Soviet communism's 74-year history was dominated by one man. Yet Stalin somehow remains less firmly fixed in historical memory for Americans than Hitler, who for us is the epitome of the tyrant leader, an icon of evil. It's estimated that Stalin was responsible for the deaths of some 10 to 20 million, while some estimates go far higher than that. Stalin is supposed to have said, "One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic." Yet his record is less known than it deserves to be, because he was an ally of the United States during World War II, presented in propaganda as Uncle Joe, a down-to-earth, honest leader of the Soviet Union. Some historians have preferred to think of Stalin as a distorter of Lenin's project, with Lenin merely a socialist in a hurry. But we need to take into account that Lenin promoted Stalin, And Lenin first created the organs that Stalin later used, expanded, and perfected: the concentration camps, secret police, and exemplary use of revolutionary terror. In fact, in his magisterial tome, The Main Currents of Marxism, Leszek Kołakowski argues that the Soviet system as it developed under Stalin was a continuation of Leninism, and that the state founded on Lenin's political and ideological principles could only have maintained itself in a Stalinist form. In fall 1929, Stalin demanded forced collectivization. He declared that now the state was moving decisively against its class enemies, the so-called kulaks, that is, modestly more prosperous peasants. Now there was to be a policy of liquidating the rich peasants as a class. Hundreds of thousands of kulaks were arrested and deported. The Red Army and tens of thousands of volunteer activists went to the countryside to conduct class warfare. Agricultural production plummeted due to peasant resistance. Not only did farmers lose incentive to plant grain, they slaughtered livestock and burned crops rather than simply turning them over to the authorities. In view of the resulting chaos, in March 1930, Stalin called a halt, blaming local officials for extreme actions as a result of being dizzy with success. But by year's end, Stalin resumed the drive. The imperative of control was just too strong. Food became state property, and a 1932 law provided the death penalty for theft of food. In Ukraine, collectivization policies caused the terror famine of 1932 to 1933, remembered by Ukrainians as the Holodomor, or hunger killing. Soviet troops seized grain from areas where hunger already threatened and closed off territories where resistance arose. In our own times of historical amnesia, we must be very clear about this. This was not a natural disaster caused by climate or drought or a bad harvest. This was a political famine engineered in one of the world's most productive agricultural areas. Estimates suggest that 5 million to 7 million people starved to death in Ukraine. Famine also struck elsewhere, like the North Caucasus and Kazakhstan. The Soviet government denied reports of the event. Stalin is said to have later casually admitted to Churchill that 10 million died.
On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Behind him was the Forbidden City, the spot from which the Chinese emperors of the Ming and Qing dynasties had ruled China for centuries. Declaring victory over the recently exiled Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang nationalists in a civil war that had enveloped China for more than 2 decades, Mao announced that China would now be led by a people's democratic dictatorship. It would be based upon an alliance between Chinese workers and peasants. The era of communist China had begun. In its founding documents, the People's Republic of China balanced a commitment to the freedoms of thought, speech, assembly, and the press with a vow to suppress all counter-revolutionary activities. Loyalty to the country became synonymous with the active support of the revolutionary ideals as stipulated by the ruling cadre. Mao went so far as to define his regime as a people's democratic dictatorship. Full inclusion in the polity was bestowed only on those whose lifestyle and philosophy coincided with what the ruling Communist Party deemed appropriate. Increasingly, as we'll see, one man, Mao Zedong, defined and judged what was acceptable. As for reactionary elements, they were deprived of political rights and punished severely, though they were also given the opportunity to reform themselves through physical labor. The new communist regime targeted class enemies through a rectification campaign that required citizens to publicly confess to their ideological failings and self-doubts. Those deemed insufficiently contrite found their way to newly established labor camps. But Mao had to contend with external as well as internal challenges. The Korean Peninsula, divided between a communist north, occupied by Soviet forces, and a capitalist south, occupied by American troops, erupted in civil war in June 1950 as North invaded South. 4 months later, in October 1950, Chinese forces entered the conflict, thereby bringing the country into confrontation with a US-led United Nations force. At the same time, more than 700,000 Chinese were labeled as counter-revolutionaries and executed between 1950 and 1952, according to official statements. This created a model to militarize the revolution, with clear linkages between patriotism and revolution that would continue to define the People's Republic. Mao continued to consolidate the power and authority of the communist regime because he was about to embark on a new stage of socialist construction in the country. In 1957, he announced the Great Leap Forward, a plan to speed up industrialization. The state had only recently organized peasants on large collective farms called people's communes in an effort to streamline and increase economic production. Now, Mao announced that the communes would shift from agriculture to steel production. The goal was for China to double its steel output in 1 year, aided by the labor of 100 million peasants pulled away from farming. Lacking financial capital, the communist regime marshaled human capital. All Chinese were called on to do their part. Predictably, the outcome was a disaster. On agricultural communes around the country, backyard blast furnaces arose. Rural workers were required to melt any metal objects they could get their hands on. Propaganda posters depicted idyllic scenes of agricultural communes churning out ample food, while in the background, furnaces efficiently produced the steel needed for modernization. But crops were left to rot, and the communal dining halls set up to feed the people soon struggled to find food. While the government censored news of the famine, scholars estimate that between 15 million and 45 million Chinese died. The man-made famine that resulted from Mao's Great Leap Forward was one of the deadliest in world history.
Some dictators are installed in office not by their predecessors, but by a foreign power. Installing a puppet regime is a convenient way for a powerful country to maintain influence over its neighbors. This method of succession was particularly evident during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union both sponsored coups and propped up authoritarians in their respective spheres of influence. Of course, neither was very loyal to its own ideology when it did so. The Soviet Union, for all its talk about empowering workers and standing up for the poor, propped up any number of outright kleptocracies. And the United States, for all its rhetoric about spreading democracy, installed some very brutal dictatorships.
It has been said that what was crafted in North Korea is the most extreme example of personality cult on record. It centers on the Kim family, which has so far provided a succession of 3 semi-divine leaders. From 1948 to the time of this presentation in 2021, 73 years. Consider that the Bolsheviks were in power for 74 years. The Soviet Union lasted for 69 years. The first leader was Kim Il-sung, known as the Great Leader, installed by Soviet forces. At first, Kim enjoyed support from both the Soviet Union and China. But when their split grew, he balanced between them in subtle shifting ways, incidentally establishing a pattern that endures in international politics to the present day. More purges against party factions aligned closely with Beijing or Moscow kept Kim as the essential balancer. As in the cases of Albania and Romania, this amounted to an especially intense assertion of national communism as a trend. To underline this assertion of independence and a Korean form of communism, Kim Il-sung crafted the ideology he called Chuche, or self-reliance, pursuing autarky and radical isolation. The four central principles of Chuche were defined as autonomy in ideology, independence in politics, self-sufficiency in economics, and self-reliance in defense. In practice, it has also meant isolation, with rigidly controlled relations to the outside world. Ordinary people have no access to outside media. A high degree of conformity is mandatory. Every household is outfitted with a radio receiver, the speaker, which broadcasts marches, songs, and proclamations. Speakers cannot be turned off or stations changed. The streets of towns and cities have blaring loudspeakers for official announcements. Settlements feature special study rooms dedicated to the leader and Chuchi thought, and one needs to wear special socks to enter these study rooms, highlighting their almost religious aura of veneration. Adopted from Mao's China, the self-criticism ritual features prominently in social life. Being contrite about failings and pledging to correct them is a sign of continuing loyalty, pledged again and again. Those who did not obey authority and conform would be sent to concentration camps, along with their extended families, ostensibly to be re-educated through hard labor and suffering. A dozen prison camps resembling the Soviet Gulag were established, holding up to an estimated 1 million. The inmates were subjected to awful abuse. Life inside the country was truly terrible for ordinary Koreans. The economy suffered especially when the Soviet Union's aid and support was removed with its unexpected collapse in 1991. Chinese aid also was replaced by more challenging market relationships. Agriculture had been neglected in favor of planned progress in heavy industry and supporting the vast military structure of the state. In the 1990s, famine gripped North Korea. Ordinary people's diets shrank, while party cadres and military elites were better supplied and spared the hunger. While it may have killed 3 million, or 10% of the population, it also left a so-called stunted generation of children. Journalists from National Geographic, who were allowed to make a rare trip to the country afterward, estimated that 40% of children showed signs of chronic malnutrition. So, for instance, the incidence of cataracts in North Korea was 10 times higher than in the developed world, not only for the elderly, but also for the young. In North Korea, 7-year-old boys are 8 inches shorter than in South Korea and 22 pounds lighter. The generational damage done by the famine will be enduring.
Still, dictatorship remains popular. For millions of people around the world, it's not just a viable option, but a preferable one. Dictators don't have to worry about elections, and that means they can undertake ambitious but costly projects that might result in their country's long-term good. And they have unparalleled capacity to muster the resources of the state, in no small part because they don't have to worry about pesky little things like human rights. Finally, authoritarian regimes don't have to put up with nearly as much gridlock or dysfunction as democracies do. And the more the world's democracies flounder, the more the world's people might end up casting their votes in favor of dictatorship. Indeed, the occasional popularity of authoritarian regimes can make it hard to distinguish between democracy and dictatorship. How do you define a regime that doesn't hold elections but would win them if it did? How do you define a regime that wins elections fairly but then uses its power to violate human rights or to persecute ethnic and religious minorities? All of these things make it hard not just to determine the survivability of dictatorship, but to define it.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the topics in this episode, the full list of series that these clips came from is in the description below. You can watch them all now on Wondrium.